Thank you very much, Inga, and over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Damien. And I am going to actually go back in time when I begin my talk. And I'm going to go back to a time when I was actually growing up, so as a small girl. And I didn't feel I really belonged at that time. And I'm sure that most people on this call today at some time have felt like the excluded one, the different one, the one that wasn't like all the others that you were with at the time. Now, I had a very happy childhood in one way, in that I was in a happy family. There were 3 siblings. I was the middle child, so maybe that also made me feel slightly different. But fundamentally, my older brother and younger sister were born with very white blonde hair. My mother being Norwegian, I think most people expected us to come out with white blonde hair. However, I was the middle child and I had dark brown hair. It's grey at the moment, but it was dark brown in those days. And so my brother and sister told me I was adopted. And they grew very, very close and were playing together all the time. Whereas I became the odd one out, or I felt like I was the odd one out, even though my parents assured me that I wasn't adopted. And they gave me just as much love as my siblings. My siblings made me feel like the adopted one. And I became a bit of a loner, I suppose, and doing things a lot on my own, even from a very young age. I would be doing, I don't know, long cycle rides and things completely on my own. But, when I look back and I sort of think, well, did that harm me in any way in the long term? Perhaps not, actually. But it probably did give me an independent streak that has been an important part of my life and has sort of shaped how I've grown and particularly progressed through my career. But it also is a stark reminder to me how easy it can be to make someone feel excluded or the different one, and as though they don't belong. And we know how important that is to have in any environment, but in the workplace particularly, that unless people are feeling that they belong, you won't get the best out of them. And we know that, and if you're not feeling included, productivity drops. Now, when I started working in the 1980s, I actually wasn't focused on my career at all. Although, I was working in a very, very male-dominated environment. It was in the insurance market in the City of London, and hardly any senior females, hardly any females actually at all that I came across, apart from those who tended to be in the typing pool in those days, because we didn't have word processing things, so there they were in typing pools and things like that. But I was on the business side, and I was training to be an underwriter, a reinsurance underwriter. And I was it was an all open plan, even in the 80s, in those days. And there were 35 of us, and I was the only female. All the others were men. And I believe, although I didn't take note at that time, white men. And I sort of became one of the lads just so that I could fit in. Also, though, sport ruled my life in those days. So I wasn't very career focused. What was more important for me was to be able to leave the office early enough and get down to the River Thames, get out on the water with my rowing crew for our daily training session. And then a few years later, I started playing rugby for Wasps, and I played at the topmost level for some years. Actually, I played 12 years, I played for Wasps. And I think the sport probably gave me the support network I needed. And so while at work, I wasn't really part of the gang, I certainly felt part of the gang when I was in my sporting environment. And that's probably what helped me get me through those early years. And most of the time, I have to say, I would say that's exactly what sport is. It's very inclusive. But for those of you, particularly if you're football fans, you may be familiar with some of the chants that were sung by away football fans when they were visiting Brighton and Hove. And I think this was going back to the 2013-14 football season. And one of the famous chants was, "You're from a town full of gays, and we hope you all die of AIDS." Now, it's quite shocking when you sort of read through that and you read through the dossier. And I think one of those things that concerned me a lot when I read about that was that it was described as banter. That those chants, which are some people found very, very offensive, were treated by some as banter, and even by police that were there and some of the stewards managing the crowds. Then they actually found some of this banter funny. So I think it's a really tough area about what then should be tolerated in these situations. Now, that was over 5 years ago, so you'd think perhaps things have changed. Well, if you go onto the internet and you Google Brighton homophobia football, I'm afraid you can read that it's still very alive, well, at least before the pandemic hit last year. And there were arrests made at Brighton matches of fans who were chanting both homophobic and, of course, now also some racist chants. And it's not happening only in the UK. We know in France, they had a serious issue a couple of years back that referees had to stop so many matches because of homophobic chants that there were talks between governing bodies and supporter associations to try and resolve things, and new measures were put in place that include fines and even prison sentences for those found guilty of discrimination in public places, so any sort of discrimination. Now, you might sort of say, well, why are you so interested in sport? I mean, aren't you more interested in the business world? Well, I am, but I'm actually, and the older I get, the more concerned I am about society at large. And there are some statistics, and Stonewall is a great place to look for some of these statistics for the LGBT community, who show, and that their statistics show that things in business are better than in sport, but still some absolutely shocking ones. So more than a third of LGBT staff, 35% have hidden that they're LGBT at work for fear of discrimination. And almost 1 in 5 LGBT staff have been the target of negative comments or conduct from work colleagues in the past year. So this is recent stuff. And we know that while many people are out when they're studying and they're students, many of them go back into the closet when they start in the world of work. And I'm so alarmed by some of these statistics still, because we've had laws against discrimination for a long, long time. But quite clearly, it's not just laws that need to be put in place. There is something much bigger, which is about the culture and the environment, so that people feel that they are supported and respected. And of course, we're really talking about trying to achieve some sort of equality, but it feels to me as though we've a long way to go until we've reached that equality of opportunity in life in general, and certainly in the workplace, and that parity that so many of us are looking for. And I certainly have, and I suppose I started on the gender equality some years ago, but now I'm much more looking at all other aspects of equality. But when we look at race and cultural differences now, which I suppose is really sort of hitting the headlines, I mean, we should be looking at ourselves and feeling quite shocked at some of our so-called sophisticated societies. Now, for those of you that can see me on the video today, I'm a white woman, and yet I'm horrified and disgusted by the racism I see and read about. And I grew up white in a basically white community, and so I don't know what it's like to grow up being black in the UK or the US or so many of these other so-called civilized societies. And I really look at these Black Lives Matter protests that are going on around the world, and I seriously hope they'll make a difference. I hope they're going to spark a real change in attitudes and behaviours, not just in the world of work, but much more broadly into society, because it is way overdue. But I do believe that there's actually a role for any business or organisation to play here, because I think if we can actually start addressing this topic and these difficult topics, the complex topic actually of how do you have a real inclusive organization, an inclusive place to be, an inclusive workplace where everyone feels belong. This is really tough. You can't just flick a switch and put in place a few policies and procedures. It doesn't sort it out. But I do believe that if organizations and businesses take it seriously, we can start to have a knock-on impact into broader society, and people will hear things in the workplace, and then potentially it'll affect a conversation they have with somebody perhaps in a social context, when we all get back to having perhaps a drink in the pub again, it might actually impact that. Now, I mentioned earlier, I've been looking at sort of gender equality for some time, because I did join in the 80s, and many years later I looked around and I said, where are all those women that joined when I joined, that joined the financial services sector? Where are they? Why aren't they leading organizations? Why are there still all these men at the top of these organizations? And I have spoken to many women on the topic, and particularly those who work in the world of insurance. And some of the women I talk to, they have chosen to leave the world of insurance just because of banter, banter that they considered to be somewhat demeaning and sexist. And I think it's something that we all have to think about. And I know there's a lot more study going on at the moment about these, what are being described as sort of microaggressions in the workplace. It's basically all those little comments that are said to you that, depending what group you're from, if someone's from another type of group or community or however they associate themselves, they will say something in a different manner, in a different way to you. And often, and the studies have actually shown this, women have more of these microaggressions. So the way something is said to them and the way they're responded to is more negative for women than it is for men. And I think there will continue to be a lot more analysis and studies into this. So I know there's the academic side, and there is a lot of work going on, but I'm now going to talk a little bit about my story and how actually, of course, whatever happens in the workplace, whatever happens in an organization can really have some sort of human side to it. Now, yes, I got to run Lloyd's of London, one of the best known global insurance brands in the world. I got to be basically the sort of top of the insurance profession, but insurance actually very nearly lost me. So I started in the early 80s, and then in the late 80s, there was an incident at my employer, one of the leading UK insurers then and still is now. And I was in a front-end trading role. So that those sort of 35 of us that I talked about, we were seeing brokers, we were negotiating deals in a face-to-face environment, very much like what you might think of the old-fashioned trading environment in the stock exchange before it all went digital. So a very, very hard-nosed sort of salesy environment. And we relied on brokers, as underwriters, we relied on the brokers to come in and see us. And there was a cricket championship going on in the Caribbean at that time, and most of these brokers enjoyed cricket. So we decided to have a series of cocktail parties in the office to celebrate the cricket. And we wanted a Caribbean theme. And courtesy of the Jamaican Tourist Board, we had lots of posters advertising Jamaica as a holiday location. And remember, this was the late 80s. So these were basically posters of women, either near naked or wearing wet T-shirts. I think you can sort of picture that scene as it was then. Well, some weeks after all of those cocktail parties took place, the posters were still up all over the office. And I thought, no, I've got to say something now. So I went to my manager one evening and I said, look, I think I've been really patient. I've put up with all of this, but I think it's time to take the posters down. And he said to me, oh, how could I have been so insensitive? Of course, we'll see to that. So I left home feeling quite chuffed with myself that I'd actually had the courage in this very male-dominated environment to go and address this with my manager, but not in an overly aggressive way, but in a sort of constructive as I could way. But I went home, and then the next day I came in and I saw that all the posters were down from the walls, but I turned the corner to see my desk and it was all wrapped up in the posters, my desk, my chair, everything. It was like wrapped up like a goddamn, gift. And so I was so mad, I walked out of the office and I didn't speak to anyone. I just went home. And at that point, I was completely disillusioned with the whole sort of financial services sector. I vowed I would never work in insurance again. And I was 27 years old and I decided to go traveling around the world. And in hindsight, the best decision I ever made. I went to various countries, all of this on my own, and I traveled for about a year. And I started my venture in India. I was just backpacking, staying in the cheapest accommodation I could find because I didn't have any money saved up. And I went to various countries in Asia. I then, after some months, turned up in Sydney, Australia, and by now I needed some money. And by luck, I got a temporary job in the BBC's office, British Broadcasting Corporation in Sydney. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story is because this was the first time I had a serious role model appear in my life that really impacted me in a positive way. And that was because the office manager of the BBC in Sydney was a woman. And I was like, wow, the most senior person is a woman. And what really struck me was that she was treated with respect. The team enjoyed working for her. And what was really amazing for me coming from the City of London in those days was that she wore trousers to the office. Now, at that time in the 80s, you could not enter the Lloyd's of London building as a woman unless you were wearing a skirt. So, well, it was only in the 70s, actually, that women were allowed to go in there at all. And that was 300 years after its formation. So that's how long it took for women to actually manage to even walk into Lloyd's, 300 years. But that was what I had come from, that environment. And here I was in Sydney looking at this woman who was just the boss, and nobody referred to her gender. And I thought, wow, you can perhaps make it to the top. And I was determined to go back and have a whole different sort of spirit to me, if you like. Go in and say, right, I'm not going to try and fit in with what others perceive to be just like them. I'm going to be me. And if I want to wear trousers to the office, I will. Hurrah. So that brief time actually made a huge impact on me. And I think none of us should ever underestimate the impact we have on others. And sometimes it doesn't have to be the big things you do. It can be all the little things you do, just ordinary things that perhaps you're not even aware of, that you're doing every day of your life, because everyone's watching you, noticing what you might say, and you can have an impact. And that woman at the BBC probably had no idea of the impact she had on me because I didn't say anything to her. Maybe I should look her up and tell her what an impact she had. But the more I realize, and the older I get, the more I realize this importance of role models. And it's no good just talking the right thing or saying the right thing. You have to mean it and demonstrate it. And of course, none of us are perfect, and we continue to learn. And thank goodness, or it could be a very dull world. But I do remember, for instance, that I actually fell into a trap of hiring a team all like me. So later on in my career, when I'd actually had my first promotion and I was starting to build a team and manage a team of people, and this was now in the 90s, mid-90s, one of these brokers, I talked about the brokers before because I ended up getting my old job back. So I went back to London, and one of these brokers who came in to see me came in one day and said, "Oh, Inga, I got the short straw today." I said, "What do you mean the short straw?" He said, "Well, I had to come in and see the Spice Girls." Now, some of you may be familiar with the Spice Girls. They were certainly around for me in the 90s. This girl band, 5 girls. And I looked and I had realized that despite there being very, very, very few females working in the insurance market in the heart of the City of London, I'd got 5 of them, or we were 5, a lineup of 5 women. So I'd fallen into the trap of hiring a team like me. I guess because during interviews, we got on somehow, we found things in common. So, and that was before I suppose I'd even learned about the importance of diversity. But that's what can happen. So I know that I fell into that trap. So I'm sure that a lot of people will end up doing the same unless we make a concerted effort to do something different when we're building teams. Now, after my travels, I said I came back to London, another phase of my life started. And sort of in the 80s, I guess I thought of myself as a heterosexual woman fighting in a man's world. Well, then after my travels, I started dating women. And then this whole other sort of phase of my life started. Now, I wasn't out at work at all. I was actually petrified. I don't really know what of particularly, and sometimes we're not quite sure what we're fearing. But I wasn't out. And even though I moved to the US with my job, I moved to France after that, I then moved to Germany, I didn't tell my employer. So all of this time, and one of the women I was with her for 12 years, actually, and we eventually got married. And she traveled with me. And we had to make all the arrangements ourselves, and particularly moving to the US at that time. That was really, really tough when we moved to the US, because you need a visa to go in. The state we moved to didn't even recognize same-sex couples, and I hadn't told my employer, so they weren't helping me or us. So the only way we worked out that she could come with me when I moved was to go as a student. So she gave up her job, enrolled in a university, and did another degree, just so that she could actually move with me. And I look back at this time, and I thought, what an idiot I was. What was I so fearful of? Well, the interesting thing for me then was it wasn't until quite a few years later that I came out. And the only reason I came out, the trigger for why I came out was because many years later, and this was now 2007, I was in Switzerland, and I was CEO of a reinsurance, so an insurance company that insures other insurance companies, so a reinsurer. And we'd had a tremendous battle on our hands because another company had come from France and put a hostile bid in for the company, and we wanted to stay independent. We didn't want to be bought by anyone else. And we fought and fought and fought, and it was a very, very difficult time. But eventually we'd managed to get the price up. And because the board has to make decisions for all the stakeholders, but particularly for shareholders, this was actually now becoming a very good deal for the other investors. So the board decided to sell the company, and I left. But this was after months and months of turmoil. Now, one of my assistant then, after this drama, she invited me out for a dinner on a Saturday night, and just the two of us. And I went along, and she started to tell me how difficult it must have been for me during these months of drama. And she asked me how on earth I had managed to cope when I was on my own and I couldn't go home and share concerns and things with anyone. And it was at that time, that dinner conversation, that I realized what an idiot I had been, that I had been lying to people at work, basically. They were now feeling sorry for me because they thought I'd been on my own. I was somehow neglecting my partner. I wasn't including her in my life at work. Goodness only knows how this had impacted me all those years of not being out in the office. And I said, this is it. This is enough is enough. And I then said, the next meeting I have about another job, maybe an interview about my next job, I'm going to come out in the interview. And that's what I did. And I got an interview with the CEO of the Zurich Insurance in Switzerland. And I don't know how many minutes into the interview I said it, but I said it fairly early on. And what did he say? He said, oh, that's great. I hope I get to meet your partner one day. And that was it. And there was nothing else ever said about it. And I sort of sat there thinking, why on earth had I been in the closet for all those years, benefiting nobody and probably harming others? So I had that, and that was my coming out experience. And since then, I've always been out about my sexuality. But I did talk about the phases in my life. And then my wife at that time, she actually left me for a younger woman. And this was back in 2011. So I then started another phase in my life and found myself in a relationship again, but with a man. So now I had the label of bisexual, and this happened around the time I moved back to London for work. And then I suppose I felt another type of exclusion. A group that I'd been very much part of, the lesbian scene, suddenly didn't know how to treat me. Did I belong with them? How could they carry on socializing with me now that many of the things we did together were in all-female groups? So it was actually quite a difficult time for me. And I was feeling very excluded from the very group of people who'd given me so much over the years. And then on top of that, there was the pressure to be a bi role model. And when I was first approached to put myself forward for the FT, it was the FT outstanding list at that time. I think it's now Yahoo Finance who sponsors the outstanding list every year. When I was first approached to put myself forward for it, I said no. I just started at Lloyd's. I thought, this is it's just too sort of risky for me. So I wasn't silent about my sexuality, but I wasn't going to go out and shout about it. Because the outstanding list recognizes the out leaders from the LGBT community as well as some of the allies. And it has a couple of lists, and it has a senior circulation around the globe, actually. I started at Lloyd's. I was faced resistance by being the first female CEO, that I thought, I'm not going to bring this to the attention of the world. I wanted to ensure that I could really get my feet under the table and really be respected for being a leader without people getting distracted about my sexuality. But I did realize that we needed to start having conversations in the market about topics that we hadn't talked about before. And back to the conversation that we had at the beginning, Damien, about financial services and how much more it's moved forward, I realized as I walked through the Lloyd's market, and this did mean physically walking through, if you like, because there was, in those days, it was a physical trading environment with about 8,000 people gathering in one big trading room every day. I could walk through, and I walked through and I realized that there were hardly any women. Never mind when I looked at the leadership team of the market, I realized there were no women. And then I saw white faces everywhere. So I walked through the market, I saw a sea of white faces. And so when I thought, something doesn't feel right here. And then I started to have town hall meetings, and I used words like gay, lesbian, and bisexual, because I had been used to talking quite openly about things like that. And these of course were in-person town halls in those days. There were giggles and perhaps heads bowed, probably an embarrassment, as I started to use words that had never been uttered, unless in a derogatory manner, in that environment before. But I didn't stop. And I believe, our employees, the people in the market, started to feel empowered, and they set up their own networks of people. So before that time, there weren't, employee resource groups or whatever they're called these days, whatever organization likes to call their own. They're very common these days, but in those days, there was nothing like that. This isn't that long ago. I only started in 2014. But I remember this sort of grassroots movement of people saying, we'd like to set up a group for this, a group for that. And I said, yes, go ahead. And I remember particularly the launch of our Pride at Lloyd's group, our LGBT network. It was launched one evening and we had some speeches and it was a celebration. And one of the men who was there, an older guy who'd been working at Lloyd's for about 30 years, he came up to me with a slight tear in his eye, actually, and he said, Inga, thank you. He said, I never thought I would see this happen in Lloyd's. I never thought I would see this day. It's quite amazing. And I thought he was going to tell me after 30 years of working at Lloyd's, he had now finally come out of the closet for the first time. But instead, he told me that his son was gay. And for years, he had not felt able to talk about it openly at work. He'd pretended that his son was heterosexual for fear of judgment, or perhaps for fear of some nasty banter in the office. And I was delighted that he had now come out about his son. But isn't that sad, as it was quite recent? But it also goes to show that if you start talking about the topic and you're senior enough and people will listen, it's amazing what you can make happen. You can empower people and they feel liberated. And sometimes it may have an impact that you may not have expected. So the fact that this guy is now proudly talking about his son at work is having a huge impact on his overall life. So that to me was a real learning. And that's why I decided to put myself forward for the FT Outstanding list. I didn't know I would get to number one. I did that year, but I realized then I needed to start being out and proud as well, and not just talking for gender equality, but for all sorts of equality. And we launched a festival, I suppose, it's Festival of Diversity and Inclusion. The first one was in September 2015, and I remember being very nervous because it was all happening around Lloyd's in the City of London. And we were dressing the building up in all these brightly coloured posters because it was meant to be sort of party time, really. And I just didn't know how it would go down with all the traditionalists in the market. And what we uncovered was, or what we unleashed, I suppose, was a passion to start talking about the topic, because so many people had felt sort of suppressed for years. And even before that first 3-day festival had ended, there were calls for it to please happen the following year. And last year it was in its 6th year, and it's now gone way beyond Lloyd's and the London insurance market. It's truly an industry-wide initiative. I think last year there were events in way over 30 countries, 60 different cities, and thousands of people participating all at the same time in a week in September. And we have these events so that people can understand the complexity of the situation, get a better understanding of other people's views, other people's points of view. And we've got to get people to understand the importance of respecting and valuing people's differences. And I realized this because when I had to modernize the market, because my main job when I was hired at Lloyd's was to introduce technology into a paper-based traditional market. And when I looked around, I realized that it was the lack of diverse voices that was actually holding the organization back. It wasn't moving forward with the times. It wasn't embracing people who didn't look like most of the people in the market. And that was stifling creativity, it was stifling innovation. And it meant that they were still stuck in their 300-year-old past and doing £30 billion of business every year on paper. And that was in 2014. So to me, it was an absolute essential to go along with the modernizing of the market, to think about that culture and to bring new and diverse voices around the table. And so I will continue to do what I can to sort of use my influence in any way to make the world a better place. I honestly believe, as I said earlier, that if we can do things within organizations and businesses, I believe it can start to seep out into broader society. And importantly, I think every single one of us can play a part. It's not just about being the most senior person in a situation. We can all do something. We can be a role model in some way or other. Every single one of us can be a role model in some way. Every single one of us can influence and make change happen from where we sit. We can speak up when we think there's inappropriate behavior being displayed or some banter that really is quite abusive to somebody. We can speak up when something feels wrong in a particular situation. And we can, I believe, use our influence to make it a better, more inclusive world. And I would urge all of you to really embrace diversity and also take it seriously and use the power that I believe we all have to make a lasting difference for the next generation who are going to come through. Because I really, really don't want them to be held back by any inequalities. And I want to be remembered for doing something about it and not for not doing something about it. So thank you very much for listening.